My name is Zara, and I am 24 years old. When my mother screamed those words at me during our last family dinner, she had no idea she was about to lose everything she had built on lies and stolen dreams. What started as another toxic argument about my independence became the moment I discovered the devastating truth about my college fund, my father's will, and the systematic betrayal that had shaped my entire life. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones plotting your downfall from the very beginning. Before we dive into this incredible journey of family vengeance and justice, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking family drama stories. Trust me, you will want to see how this tale of betrayal and sweet revenge unfolds, because what my mother did next will absolutely blow your mind. The argument started over something so trivial I almost laugh thinking about it now. I had mentioned wanting to take a photography course to expand my freelance business, and my mother immediately launched into her usual lecture about how I was wasting my college degree and throwing away opportunities she had sacrificed. Everything to give me. Zara, you have a perfectly good marketing degree that cost us $30,000, and you want to play with cameras like some teenager. She shrieked from across the dining table, her fork clattering against her plate. If you are so smart and independent, then maybe you should start paying your own bills instead of living here rent-free. My stepfather Marcus sat there silently as he always did during these explosive moments, methodically cutting his chicken, while my mother spiraled into another one of her dramatic performances. My younger half-brother Dylan, now 16, rolled his eyes and excused himself from the table, probably grateful to escape another episode of the Zara is a Disappointment show. "Mom, I am not asking you for money," I replied calmly, though my hands were trembling slightly. "I have been saving from my freelance work, and I contribute to groceries every month. I just mentioned the course because I thought you might be interested in my career development." She laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and cruel. "Career development? You make maybe $500 a month taking pictures of other people's babies and engagement parties. That is not a career, that is a hobby that got out of hand." Something inside me snapped. For 24 years, I had endured her constant criticism, her passive-aggressive comments about my choices, and her never-ending comparisons to my more successful cousins. But this time felt different. This time, there was something in her tone that suggested she knew exactly how to hurt me the most. "You know what, Mom, maybe you are right. Maybe it is time I moved out and started paying my own bills. At least then I would not have to listen to this constant negativity every single day." Her face went white, then red, then a mottled purple that should have been medically concerning. "Fine, but do not come crawling back when reality hits you. And do not expect any help from your college fund money, because that ship has sailed." The words hung in the air, like smoke after a gunshot. College fund money? I had graduated 2 years ago, and as far as I knew, there had never been a college fund. I had taken out student loans, worked 2 part-time jobs throughout school, and graduated with the debt to prove it. "What college fund?" I asked quietly, but something in my voice must have alerted her to her mistake, because her eyes widened immediately. Marcus finally looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. Dylan had reappeared in the doorway, apparently drawn back by the shift in energy. Nothing. There was never. "I meant your student loans," she stammered, but I could see the panic building behind her eyes. "Mom, what college fund? You told me we could not afford to help with college, which is why I took out loans and worked myself into exhaustion every semester." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my mother's face cycle through a dozen different emotions before landing on defensive anger, her default setting when caught in a corner. There might have been some money set aside, but it had to be used for other things. Marcus was between jobs, and we had the mortgage refinancing, and Dylan needed. How much money? My voice had gone deadly quiet, which anyone who knew me well would recognize as a very bad sign. "Zara, you do not understand how expensive it is to run a household. There were bills and unexpected expenses, and we always planned to pay it back." "How much money, Mom?" Marcus cleared his throat. "Maybe we should discuss this privately as a family." Something about the way he said family made my skin crawl. I had never been his family, not really. I had always been the complication from my mother's first marriage, the reminder that she had a life before him. No, I said firmly. We are discussing this right now. How much of my college fund did you steal? The word steal hit the room like a physical blow. My mother's mask finally slipped completely, and I saw her for what she really was, a woman who had been caught red-handed and was scrambling to minimize the damage. It was not stealing, it was borrowing. The money was sitting there and you were already getting loans anyway, and we had real emergencies. How much I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. $50,000, Marcus said quietly, and my mother shot him a look that could have melted steel. Your father left it in a trust for your education. We accessed it when Dylan was diagnosed with his learning disabilities and needed special tutoring. The room started spinning. $50,000. My father, who had died when I was 8, had left me $50,000 for college. $50,000 that would have covered my entire education and left me debt-free to start my adult life. $50,000 that my mother and stepfather had stolen to pay for their lifestyle and their priorities. My father left me $50,000. I repeated slowly, testing the words to see if they would make more sense the second time. They did not. Zara, honey, you have to understand. Dylan needed help and the tutoring was so expensive, and Marcus had been laid off and we were going to pay it back as soon as we got back on our feet. 8 years, I whispered. Dylan was 8 when he was diagnosed. I was 16. You stole my inheritance when I was 16 years old, and you have been lying to me for 8 years. The magnitude of their betrayal was starting to sink in. Every night, I had stayed up until 3 in the morning working at the campus bookstore. Every meal of ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. Every time I had to choose between buying textbooks and paying for gas to get to work. All of it unnecessary. All of it because the people who were supposed to protect me had stolen my future to fund their own. We were going to tell you, my mother said weakly, when the time was right, when we had the money to pay you back. 8 years, Mom. 8 years, and you watched me struggle every single day, knowing you had stolen the money my father left to prevent exactly that struggle. The worst part was not even the money, though. That was devastating enough. The worst part was the realization that everything I thought I knew about my family, about my relationship with my mother, about my place in this house had been built on lies. That night I did not sleep. I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the relics of a life I was rapidly realizing had been built on deception, and I made lists. Not emotional, tear-stained lists of hurt feelings and betrayed trust, but cold, methodical lists of facts and evidence and legal options. By morning, I had a plan. The first item on my agenda was documentation. I needed proof of the trust, proof of the theft, and proof of their ongoing deception. My mother had always been careless with paperwork, leaving important documents scattered around the house in various drawers and filing cabinets. She had never expected me to go looking. While she was at her weekly book club meeting and Marcus was at work, I systematically searched every inch of their home office. What I found was worse than I had imagined. The trust documents were exactly where I expected them to be, filed under important papers in my mother's typically disorganized filing system. $50,000 left by my father specifically for my education, with my mother named as trustee, until I turned 21. The money should have been turned over to me completely 3 years ago, but the trust was only the beginning. Hidden behind the legitimate documents, I found a paper trail that painted a picture of financial irresponsibility and outright fraud that made my stomach turn. They had not just taken my college fund money, they had systematically looted it over the course of 6 years, using it to pay for everything from Dylan's expensive private school tuition to a luxury vacation to Hawaii, from Marcus's failed business venture to a complete kitchen renovation. Every withdrawal was documented, every lie carefully cataloged in my mother's own handwriting. The vacation photos were still on her Facebook page. My mother and Marcus sipping cocktails on a beach in Maui, posted with the caption, "Sometimes you just have to treat yourself." I remembered that trip. I had been a sophomore in college working double shifts at the campus coffee shop to afford textbooks, and my mother had called to tell me how sorry she was that they could not help with my expenses because money was so tight. She had been drinking cocktails bought with my father's money while I was living on food bank donations. The private school tuition for Dylan was particularly infuriating. Not because Dylan did not deserve a good education, but because of the timing. They had enrolled him in the exclusive academy the same year I had started college, the same year they told me they could not afford to help with my education. They had literally chosen to spend my inheritance on their biological child while watching their stepchild struggle. Marcus's business venture was documented in excruciating detail. $47,000 invested in a revolutionary protein powder company that had folded within 6 months. My mother's notes on the margins showed she had known it was a risky investment, but she had approved it anyway, because Marcus deserves a chance to prove himself. With my money. With my dead father's money that had been specifically designated for my future. I photographed every document, every receipt, every bank statement. I uploaded everything to a secure cloud storage account and emailed copies to myself from multiple addresses. Then I researched attorneys. By the time my mother returned from book club, I was sitting calmly at the kitchen table with my laptop open, looking for all the world like I was working on a photography project. She made small talk about her friends and their various dramas, apparently having convinced herself that the previous night's confrontation would blow over like all our other arguments. "How was your day, sweetheart?" she asked, opening the refrigerator and pulling out ingredients for dinner. "Did you think any more about what we discussed last night?" The casual tone, the pet name, the complete lack of acknowledgement of her massive betrayal. It was exactly what I had expected, and it crystallized my resolve. "Actually, I did think about it," I said pleasantly. "I think you are right. It is time for me to take control of my own finances." She smiled, apparently relieved that I was being so reasonable. "I am glad you see it that way. Sometimes tough love is exactly what people need to grow up and take responsibility." "Absolutely," I agreed. "In fact, I have already contacted an attorney about recovering the $50,000 you stole from my trust fund." The mixing bowl slipped from her hands and shattered on the kitchen floor, sending ceramic shards scattering across the tile. Her face went through the same color progression as the night before. White to red to purple, but this time I was ready for it. What I found all the documents, Mom. The trust paperwork, the withdrawal records, the receipts for Dylan's tuition and your vacation and Marcus's failed business. All of it. Every single dollar you stole from me, over the past 8 years. She was staring at me like I had grown a second head. "You went through my private papers. You had no right. Those papers document the theft of my inheritance. I had every right. We did not steal anything. That money was used for family expenses, and you are part of this family, whether you want to admit it or not." The gaslighting was almost impressive in its audacity. Even faced with irrefutable evidence of their theft, she was still trying to make me feel guilty for being angry about it. "Family," I repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call it when you steal from your child to pay for your stepchild's private school? When you use your dead husband's money to fund your new husband's business ventures? When you take exotic vacations while your daughter lives on food stamps? You do not understand what it is like to manage a household budget. I understand perfectly. What I do not understand is how you managed to lie to my face for 8 years about it." Marcus chose that moment to walk through the front door, calling out his usual greeting. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway and saw my mother standing in a pile of broken ceramic with tears streaming down her face, while I sat calmly at the table, his expression immediately shifted to high alert. "What is going on? Zara hired a lawyer," my mother whispered, like the words physically hurt to say. Marcus's face went very still. "I see. The attorney says I have an excellent case for both the recovery of the stolen funds and punitive damages for the breach of fiduciary duty," I continued conversationally. "Apparently, when you are named as a trustee, you have a legal obligation to protect the beneficiary's interests, not raid their inheritance for personal expenses." Zara, Marcus said carefully, "I think we should all sit down and discuss this rationally. I am being perfectly rational. I am rationally pursuing the recovery of my stolen inheritance through the legal system exactly as any rational person would do. The beautiful thing about my new approach was how completely it wrong-footed them. They had expected tears, drama, emotional manipulation, all the tools they had used to control me for years. They had not expected cold, methodical action backed by legal documentation. The next few days were a masterclass in watching people reveal their true characters under pressure. My mother oscillated between tearful apologies and vicious attacks, sometimes within the same conversation. Marcus tried to play the role of reasonable mediator while simultaneously attempting to hide additional evidence of their financial mismanagement. And Dylan, poor Dylan, was caught in the middle of a war he did not understand. But the most revealing reactions came from the extended family. I had always known that my mother's relationship with her siblings was complicated, but I had attributed the tension to normal family dynamics. Now I was beginning to understand that there might have been more to those whispered conversations and abruptly ended phone calls over the years. My Aunt Sarah was the first person I called. She was my mother's younger sister, and she had always been kind to me, though we were not particularly close. When I explained the situation, her response was not shock or disbelief. It was resignation. "Oh, honey," she sighed. "I was wondering when this would finally come out. You knew I suspected. Your mother asked to borrow money from me about 5 years ago, said it was for some emergency repairs to the house. But then I saw the Facebook photos from their Hawaii trip, and the timeline did not add up. When I asked her about it, she got very defensive and said they had gotten a great deal through Marcus's work connections." Sarah paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "Then there was the conversation I overheard at Dylan's graduation party. Your mother was talking to Marcus about how they needed to be careful with the documentation, something about making sure everything looked legitimate if anyone ever asked questions. It did not make sense to me at the time, but now. Why did not you say anything? What could I say? I had no proof, and you seemed to be doing fine in college. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. But honestly, Zara, your mother has always had issues with money and boundaries. Do you remember when your grandmother died?" I did remember. I was 12 and my grandmother's death had been devastating. But there had been something strange about the aftermath, something about the will and my mother's sudden defensiveness about my grandmother's belongings. "Your grandmother left you her jewelry collection," Sarah continued. "Nothing incredibly valuable, but sentimental pieces that had been in our family for generations. Your mother was supposed to hold them for you until you turned 18. Do you still have them?" My stomach dropped. I had never received any jewelry from my grandmother. My mother had told me that my grandmother had left everything to her children equally, and that I should not expect any special inheritance just because I was the only granddaughter. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I never got any jewelry." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "She told us she had given them to you when you turned 18, that you were keeping them in a safety deposit box until you got married." Another lie. Another theft. Another betrayal that stretched back years before I had even known to look for it. "How much more?" I whispered. "How much more did she steal from me? I do not know, sweetheart. But I think it might be time to find out." Sarah connected me with my Uncle Tom, my mother's older brother, who had always been the family historian. Tom had copies of my grandmother's will, photos of the jewelry collection, and most importantly, documentation of a small savings account my grandmother had set up for me that was supposed to mature when I turned 21. Another account I had never heard of. Another inheritance that had mysteriously disappeared. "Your mother was supposed to be managing all of your inherited assets," Tom explained during our phone call. "Your father's trust, your grandmother's jewelry and savings account, even the small life insurance policy your grandfather left for his grandchildren. She was named as guardian of your interests in all of these documents. How much are we talking about total? Conservatively, probably close to $80,000, not counting interest and appreciation over the years. $80,000. My mother had not just stolen my college fund. She had systematically looted every inheritance I had ever received, leaving me with nothing while convincing me I had never been owed anything to begin with. But the family revelations were not finished. My cousin Jessica, Sarah's daughter, called me that evening with information that made everything else pale in comparison. "I need to tell you something," she said without preamble, "about your father's life insurance policy." "What about it, the big one? Not the little policy Grandpa left for the grandchildren. The one from your dad's work that was supposed to take care of you and your mom after he died." I had never heard of any life insurance policy beyond the small amount that had covered my father's funeral expenses. But as Jessica explained, there had been a substantial policy through my father's employer that should have provided financial security for years. "My mom has the paperwork," Jessica continued. "She kept copies because she was worried about how your mother was handling your father's affairs after he died. The policy was for $200,000, Zara. Half was supposed to go to your mother immediately, and half was supposed to go into a trust for you. $200,000. Half of it mine, sitting in a trust that I had never heard of, managed by a woman who had been systematically stealing from me for over a decade. Where did the money go? That is what we have been trying to figure out. The insurance company confirms that both payments were made. Your mother received her $100,000 and the other $100,000 was deposited into a trust account with her as the trustee. But when my mom tried to ask about it a few years ago, your mother claimed the money had been used for your medical expenses when you were sick as a teenager." I remembered being sick. I had been 14 and had developed a serious case of pneumonia that had required hospitalization. But our insurance had covered most of the costs, and what they had not covered had been maybe a few $1,000s at most. "She used my father's life insurance money to buy their house," I said suddenly, the pieces clicking into place. "They bought the house when I was 15. I remember my mother being so excited about finally being able to afford something nice, but she said it was because Marcus had gotten a promotion at work." "Zara," Jessica said gently, "I think your inheritance paid for most of their lifestyle for the past decade." The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. It was not just the college fund or the jewelry or the savings account. It was everything. Every dollar my father had worked to provide for my future. Every small inheritance from grandparents who had loved me. Every bit of financial security that should have been mine. All of it stolen by the person who was supposed to protect it. But now I had allies. Family members who had been suspicious for years and were finally ready to speak up. Documentation, dating back to my childhood. And most importantly, I had a paper trail that showed exactly where my money had gone. My attorney was very interested in the life insurance information. As she explained, the theft of inherited funds by a trustee was not just a civil matter. If the amounts were large enough and the deception deliberate enough, it could be considered criminal fraud. "The life insurance policy changes everything," she told me. "We are not just talking about a college fund anymore. We are talking about systematic embezzlement of inherited assets over more than a decade. The district attorney is going to want to hear about this." When I hung up the phone, I realized that somewhere in the process of documenting my mother's theft, I had stopped being angry. I had moved past anger into something much more dangerous, cold, calculating determination. My mother had spent years teaching me that I was not worth investing in, that my dreams and goals were frivolous, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of support she was willing to provide. She had made me feel guilty for needing textbooks and ashamed for asking for help with groceries, all while living in a house bought with my inheritance and funding her lifestyle with my father's life insurance money. The time for family meetings and tearful apologies had passed. It was time for justice. The criminal fraud charges were filed on a Tuesday morning in October. I had specifically requested that timing because I knew my mother would be at her book club surrounded by all the neighborhood women she had spent years impressing with stories of her successful family and beautiful home, the home that my inheritance had purchased. Detective Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit called me at exactly 9:30 to confirm that the arrest warrant had been executed. My mother and Marcus had been taken into custody at their respective workplaces, ensuring maximum humiliation and professional consequences. I had not requested this level of public exposure, but I certainly had not objected to it either. "Mrs. Patterson seemed genuinely shocked that you had pressed charges, Detective Morrison told me. She kept insisting this was a family matter that should be handled privately. She had 16 years to handle it privately, I replied. She chose to steal instead. The local newspaper picked up the story by that afternoon. Local woman charged with embezzling deceased husband's life insurance was not exactly the headline my mother had envisioned for herself when she had spent years cultivating her image as a devoted mother and pillar of the deceased five-time community. But the real justice came from an unexpected source. Dylan called me that evening crying so hard I could barely understand him. At 16, he was old enough to comprehend what his parents had done and, more importantly, old enough to understand that his entire life had been funded by stolen money. "Zara, I am so sorry," he sobbed. "I had no idea. I thought the private school and the tutoring and everything was just because Dad had gotten better jobs. I never knew they took your money." My heart broke for him. Dylan had never asked to be part of this scheme. He had been a child who needed help with his learning disabilities, and his parents had chosen to fund that help through theft, rather than making the financial sacrifices that most families would have made. "This is not your fault," I told him firmly. "You were 8 years old when this started. You could not have known. But I benefited from it. Everything I have, my education, my opportunities, it all came from money that should have been yours." The guilt in his voice reminded me why I had originally hesitated to pursue criminal charges. Dylan was innocent in all of this, and he was about to lose everything just as surely as I had. But then he surprised me. "I want to make it right," he said. "I do not know how, but I want to help fix this." Over the following weeks, Dylan became my most unexpected ally. He provided access to financial records I had not been able to find, including bank statements that showed the exact amounts transferred from my various trust accounts. More importantly, he corroborated the timeline of their spending, confirming that major purchases had coincided with withdrawals from my inheritance funds. His testimony was devastating to my mother's defense strategy. She had planned to claim that the money had been used for family emergencies and legitimate household expenses. It was much harder to make that argument when her own son could testify that they had never experienced any financial emergencies, and that their lifestyle had actually improved dramatically around the time my trust funds were being depleted. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for November. I had expected my mother to plead guilty and try to negotiate a settlement, but her attorney had apparently convinced her that she could fight the charges successfully. This turned out to be a massive miscalculation. The prosecution had done their homework. They had traced every dollar of my stolen inheritance, documented every lie my mother had told to cover up the theft, and assembled a paper trail that painted a picture of deliberate, systematic fraud spanning more than a decade. But the most damaging evidence came from my mother herself. During her deposition, she was asked about the various explanations she had given family members for her improved financial situation over the years. The attorney methodically walked through each lie, each contradiction, each attempt to cover up her theft with additional deception. "Mrs. Patterson, you told your sister Sarah that you could afford the Hawaii vacation because your husband had received travel vouchers through his work. Is that true?" We did get a discount through his company. "But the vacation cost $4,000, and according to your husband's employer, no travel discounts were provided to employees that year." "Where did the $4,000 come from?" "We had been saving." "From which account? Because according to your bank statements, your joint checking and savings accounts were overdrawn during that time period." "We may have used some of the money from Zara's trust temporarily." $4,000 from your daughter's college fund was used temporarily for a luxury vacation. And so it went, each lie unraveling under scrutiny, each attempt to minimize her actions, only making them seem more calculated and cruel. The judge's decision was swift and uncompromising. My mother was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution plus interest and penalties. Marcus received 18 months and was held equally liable for the financial damages, but the criminal penalties were only the beginning. The civil lawsuit I had filed simultaneously was progressing through the courts, and my attorney was confident we could recover not just the stolen principal, but also the compound interest and investment growth the money should have earned over the years, plus punitive damages for the breach of fiduciary duty. The preliminary calculations put my potential recovery at over $300,000. $300,000 that would have to come from somewhere, and the most obvious source was the house they had purchased with my inheritance money. The house where I was still living in the bedroom I had occupied since I was 8 years old, watching my mother's carefully constructed life crumble around her. The foreclosure notice was posted on our front door on a gray December morning, exactly 60 days after my mother's sentencing. I took a photo of it before bringing it inside to Dylan, who was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his cereal bowl. He had aged years in the past few months. The carefree teenager who had rolled his eyes at family drama was gone, replaced by a young man who understood that actions have consequences and that those consequences do not always fall on the people who deserve them most. "How long do we have?" he asked without looking up. 30 days to vacate. The house will be sold at auction to satisfy the restitution order." He nodded like he had been expecting this news, which he probably had. We both knew that my mother and Marcus had no other assets of significant value. The house was the only way to recover the money they had stolen from me. "Where will you go?" I asked gently. My friend Jake's family said I could stay with them until graduation. After that. He shrugged helplessly. "I guess I will figure it out." The unfairness of Dylan's situation was the only part of this entire ordeal that gave me pause. He was losing his home, his stability, and his college prospects because of choices his parents had made when he was too young to understand them. In many ways, he was as much a victim of their theft as I was. But I had learned something important about justice over the past few months. Sometimes the innocent get hurt when the guilty face consequences. That does not mean the consequences should be avoided. My mother's friends from book club had stopped calling weeks ago. The story had spread through our small community like wildfire, and the woman who had spent years positioning herself as a model of maternal sacrifice and family values was now known as the person who had stolen her dead husband's life, insurance money, and her daughter's college fund to fund a lifestyle she could not afford. The social consequences were almost as devastating as the legal ones. My mother had built her entire identity around being respected and admired by her peers. She had lost all of that overnight, and the humiliation was eating her alive. She called me from prison exactly once, 3 weeks after her sentencing. "Zara, please," she said, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "You have to drop the civil suit. If you take the house, Dylan will have nothing. He is just a child." "Dylan is the same age I was when you started stealing my inheritance," I replied calmly. "If you were concerned about his welfare, you should have thought about that before you spent 16 years committing fraud. He is innocent in this, so was I." The silence stretched between us, filled with all the words we had never said to each other, all the honesty that had been buried under years of lies and manipulation. "I know you hate me," she whispered finally. "I know I destroyed everything. But please do not destroy him too." For just a moment I felt the old familiar tug of guilt and responsibility that she had used to control me for so many years. The impulse to sacrifice my own needs to protect the family harmony, the trained response of taking care of everyone else's feelings before my own. But then I remembered the nights I had stayed awake crying because I could not afford textbooks. I remembered the shame of having to use food stamps while my mother posted photos of expensive dinners on social media. I remembered the years of believing that my dreams were not worth investing in because there simply was not enough money, all while she was living in a house purchased with my father's life insurance money. "You destroyed him," I said quietly. "You destroyed all of us. I am just cleaning up the mess you made." I hung up the phone and never spoke to her again. The house sold at auction for $280,000, which covered the restitution order and left a small surplus that went toward my legal fees. Dylan moved in with his friend's family, and I used part of my recovered inheritance to rent a small apartment across town. But the most satisfying consequence was entirely unexpected. Marcus's employer, a regional banking company, conducted their own investigation once his criminal charges became public knowledge. What they discovered was that his theft from my trust funds was not an isolated incident. He had been embezzling from client accounts for years using the same techniques he had perfected while stealing my inheritance. The bank fired him immediately and filed additional criminal charges. His sentence was extended to 5 years, and he was ordered to pay restitution to multiple victims. It turned out that the man who had helped steal my future had been stealing from other people's futures as well. The skills he had developed robbing his stepdaughter had served him well in his professional theft career. The irony was not lost on me that my pursuit of justice for my own case had led to justice for victims I had never even known existed. Meanwhile, my photography business was thriving, with my recovered inheritance providing financial stability for the first time in my adult life. I was able to invest in better equipment, take time to develop my skills, and be selective about the clients I accepted. The woman who had been told her artistic dreams were frivolous and unrealistic was now earning more in a month than she had ever made working for someone else. But the greatest vindication came from an unexpected source. Sarah called me in February with news that my grandmother's jewelry had been found. My mother, in a desperate attempt to raise cash for her legal defense, had tried to sell the pieces to a local antique dealer. The dealer, who had known my grandmother personally, had recognized the distinctive pieces and contacted Sarah instead of completing the purchase. Every ring, every necklace, every brooch that had been promised to me and then stolen was returned to its rightful owner. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace to the final court hearing where the judge officially closed the case and declared all restitution requirements satisfied. Justice, as it turned out, was not just about money. It was about truth, acknowledgement, and the restoration of what had been taken. 1 year later, I was sitting in the same coffee shop where I had once worked to double shifts for the heritage. This time, I was there as a customer editing photos on my laptop while sipping a latte that cost more than I used to spend on food in an entire day. The transformation was not just financial, though the security of having my inheritance restored had fundamentally changed my relationship with money and planning for the future. The real change was deeper than that. For the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be valued, to have my worth acknowledged, and to live without the constant undercurrent of guilt and obligation that had shaped every decision I had made for 24 years. Dylan had graduated high school and, against all odds, had received a full scholarship to the state university. His grades had actually improved after our family imploded, as if the stress of living in a house built on lies had been weighing him down more than any of us had realized. We had dinner together once a month, now a tradition we had started after he turned 18 and aged out of the foster care system. The relationship between us had evolved into something neither of us had expected, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what we had survived. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not found those documents?" he asked during our most recent dinner, apropos of nothing in particular. I considered the question seriously. I think I would have spent my whole life feeling like something was wrong but never understanding what it was. I would have kept trying to earn love and approval from people who were never capable of giving it genuinely. Do you think they ever loved us, really loved us? It was a question I had been grappling with in therapy, which had become an essential part of my healing process. My therapist had helped me understand that people are capable of loving others while simultaneously harming them, and that those contradictory realities can coexist in ways that are profoundly damaging to the people being both loved and harmed. "I think my mother loved the idea of being a good mother," I said finally. "But she loved her comfort and status more than she loved my actual well-being. And I think Marcus never really saw me as family at all. I was always just an obstacle to his vision of the life he wanted with her." Dylan nodded thoughtfully. "I used to feel guilty about that, about being the child they prioritized. You should not feel guilty about being loved, even if that love came at my expense. You did not make their choices. but the most unexpected development had been the relationship I had built with my father's side of the family. Armed with the knowledge of what my mother had stolen from me, I had reached out to my paternal aunt, someone I had not spoken to since I was a child. It turned out that my father's family had been trying to maintain contact with me for years, but my mother had systematically blocked their efforts. She had returned their cards and letters, declined their invitations, and told them I was not interested in having a relationship with them. Another lie. Another theft, this time of relationships and family connections that could have provided support and love during the hardest years of my life. My Aunt Rebecca had welcomed me back into the family with open arms, sharing stories about my father that my mother had never told me, and introducing me to cousins I had never known existed. For the first time, I understood where my artistic interests had come from. My father had been a talented photographer himself, a hobby my mother had never mentioned. "He would be so proud of what you have built," Rebecca told me, looking through my portfolio during one of our regular Sunday dinners. "And he would be proud of how you fought for yourself. He always said the most important thing he could teach you was to never let anyone make you smaller than you were meant to be." The financial restoration had been satisfying, but the emotional restoration was transformative. I was learning what healthy family relationships looked like, what unconditional love felt like, and how to trust my own instincts about people and situations. My photography business had expanded beyond anything I had imagined possible. The story of my legal battle had spread through local social media, and I had gained a reputation not just for my artistic skills but for my integrity and strength. People wanted to support the woman who had fought back against family betrayal and won. But more importantly, I had learned to value my own dreams and ambitions. The woman who had been told her artistic pursuits were frivolous was now booked months in advance, charging premium rates and selective about the projects she accepted. 6 months ago, I had been featured in a regional magazine article about successful young entrepreneurs. The photographer who had taken my portrait had used the same coffee shop where I was now sitting, and seeing that article framed on the wall behind the counter never failed to make me smile. The girl who had served coffee here for minimum wage was now successful enough to be featured on the wall as local inspiration. My mother and Marcus had been released from prison last month, but I had no contact with them and no interest in rebuilding those relationships. They had moved to another state, apparently unable to face the community where everyone knew their story. Sometimes people asked if I felt guilty about the consequences my actions had brought down on my family. The answer was always the same: I felt responsible for seeking justice, but not responsible for the fact that justice had consequences. They had made their choices every day for 16 years. I had simply ensured that those choices finally caught up with them. As I packed up my laptop and prepared to leave the coffee shop, I thought about the scared, exhausted college student I had been just 2 years ago, working at this same location, and believing that struggling was normal, that dreams were luxuries, and that family meant accepting whatever treatment was offered. That girl could never have imagined the life I was living now. The financial security, the thriving business, the healthy relationships, the sense of self-worth that no one could take away. But most importantly, she could never have imagined the peace that comes from knowing that justice is possible, that truth eventually surfaces, and that sometimes the people who try to make you smaller only end up proving how strong you really are. Have you ever had to fight for justice within your own family? Have you experienced the karma that comes when people face consequences for their betrayals? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us all heal and grow stronger. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that fighting for yourself is always worth it, no matter how difficult the journey becomes. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of transformation and justice, and remember that your dreams and your worth are never negotiable, no matter what anyone tries to tell you. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to demand better, and I hope my story inspires you to never settle for less than you deserve.